Israeli missile strikes. Any layman like me would be able to see that there is a big difference between the two. So the Israelis failed in Gaza, they failed in Lebanon, they failed against Iran, and they will continue to fail. But the West will empower them to keep the slaughter going. Because as I said, the West is so utterly evil that it will allow the Israelis to obliterate the Palestinian people, and they will continue to support it if it comes to that. But it won't, because the Israeli regime will fail, and it will be forced to end this war at some point. And when it does, the war will end in failure. And that will be a very important turning point for the demise of the regime. And one point that I think is also important is that the objective now for the Israeli regime is to bring in the United States. They want the United States to enter the war, and which is not impossible. The Americans obviously don't want it, but Netanyahu doesn't care about the United States. He doesn't care about India. He doesn't care about any country, because if the Americans come into the war, then the Iranians will have to destroy all American bases in the Persian Gulf. But far more important than the American bases is that those countries that host those bases, they will cease to exist. They are small, weak, vulnerable regimes that do not have the ability to defend themselves. Their oil and gas installations will be gone. So if the Americans start a war, then it's war, because this will be a fight for our survival. And the Iraqi resistance will wipe out the Americans in Iraq and Syria immediately. Immediately. It will be very swift. And that would lead to a global economic collapse that will impact the world for probably decades. Does Israel care? No. Does Netanyahu care? No. He doesn't care about India. He doesn't care about the United States. He doesn't care about Europe. He doesn't care about anyone. They care about themselves. Iran does not want the war to expand, but Iran will retaliate. Why? Because if Iran doesn't retaliate and create deterrence, the regime will just do it again, because the Americans and the Europeans will enable them to do it. They enable them to carry out a Holocaust. You think they won't allow them to carry out another strike on Iran? Of course they will. The West will give them whatever they need. So Iran has to create deterrence. Iran has to slap down Netanyahu because the West won't yank hard on his leash. And so we are in a dangerous situation, because Iran will have to respond, and Iran will strike hard, very hard. And I think these people should take me seriously, because in the past, when I said Iran will strike, the last time around, they said they won't, but we saw what happened. This time, Iran will hit very hard. And what will the Israeli regime do in response? Who knows? What will happen? I don't know. There are different scenarios. But if the Americans get involved, then everything will change. But the Americans won't win. Everyone will lose.
You made the key argument, in fact, key point, I would say, that the escalation in Lebanon and then eventually to Iran is fundamentally born out of Israel's failure to make Gaza unlivable or ethnically cleanse Gaza out of the Palestinians completely. And there are reports now that says that in the immediate wake of October 1, when the ground incursions had started, some of those protesters were protesting against Netanyahu, not because they oppose colonialism, but primarily because of Netanyahu's failure to bring back the hostages. They were much more sympathetic and supportive of the government, of the Zionist regime, because the war had escalated. And I think it is in this light one must understand the Israeli escalation to Lebanon and eventually to Iran. And I think this ties to your second key point, that this is not Israel itself, but the Israeli-American alliance that is after Iran. And even with the recent on Saturday attack, I mean, one U.S. defense official says that it is almost entirely likely that F-35 stealth fighters were used to initially cleared the airspace, creating what they call the air corridor through Syria, because they say that the Americans control the Syrian airspace and Iraqi airspace. So it's almost inconceivable to go into Iran without full support of American military, and eventually using even maybe the heavier F-16 and F-15, also the C-2 refueling aircraft. So can you this is my last point on this. You make this important point that the Iranian preparation for defense and resistance has been not particularly against Israel, which is one piece of it, but actually against the superpower itself in the wake of the invasion after the 9/11 of Afghanistan, of Iraq, and so on. A lot of people, I think, fails to understand the Iranian strengths because they don't understand the context, or maybe there is a lot of amnesia regarding the full American strategy of invading Iran, which they had to back down. Can you give us a little bit of historical context on that?
A couple of things first. One is that to put it in language that is understandable to the West, before the Israeli attack on Iran, the markets in Iran were down. And anyone can look this up. It's all online. And the Iranian rial depreciated. The stock market was down. The morning after, hours after the so-called attack, that the Iranians would not know what hit it, or what hit them, markets went straight up. And to use Western terminology, the markets, you can't hide many things from the markets. You can, someone can put, I don't know, patriotic music on television and say that we destroyed the enemy and all that, but markets are markets. They're going to look for the facts and to, figure out. The markets saw this as a failure. That's why they went up so much. So to put it in language that is understandable to Western elites and those who are in power, that I think is significant. So it was obvious it was a failure. Second, what I would like to point out is that the F-35 is not a very good plane, and it's first of all, it's not as stealth as they pretend it to be, and second of all, the payload is very small. It was a failed project, and especially since the Israelis have been using F-35s with the support of the Americans. This was a joint American-Israeli operation. The Americans were part of this aggression against Iran, and they will pay up the price. There are many ways to make the Americans pay a price, and they will pay the price. Remember, they are occupying Iraq and Syria, and Iran has many friends in Iraq, as everyone knows. So, and they're not proxies; they're allies. If proxies don't win against a much more powerful foe. A proxy doesn't defeat this Israeli regime, which has, as I said, an air bridge from Europe and the United States. They don't win battles despite the other side having all the weapons and bunker busters that they need, and 40 white European countries and Western countries providing them with all the intelligence. Their embassies are involved. Their NGOs are involved in spying. Many of their reporters are involved in spying. Their drones are flying over the Mediterranean to help with the genocide in Gaza and the genocidal strikes in Lebanon. They're giving them political cover. They give them ammunition, weapons, and of course the Western media tries to whitewash all their crimes. So these are not proxies in Yemen that make the Red Sea unusable for the Israeli regime and its allies. These are not proxies in Gaza, which are standing in defiance well after a year of Holocaust. And these are not proxies in Lebanon, which are humiliating the Israeli regime, who was supposed to take southern Lebanon. They said we destroyed the leadership, and now it will be a piece of cake. They've been humiliated. So these are not proxies. But in any case, these allies will be able to punish the Americans as they are punishing the Israeli regime. But um, I think it's important to note that what the weapons that the Israelis used, now that they've used them, and the planes that they've used, and the operation that they carried out, a lot of information has been gathered as a result. And the Russians and the Chinese will be very happy to learn about what sort of information has been gathered. And so basically what the Israelis have done is that they've created an opportunity for Iran, Russia, and China to better understand US capabilities. So the Israeli regime, by carrying out this operation, have imposed a huge cost for the entire US military. That's a key point.
A very
But
quick, sorry, go ahead.
yes, but historically, the United States, after invading Iraq and Afghanistan, they had effectively surrounded Iran. Remember, back then, Russia was a weak country. China was still growing. The US was able to bully these countries into accepting sanctions against Iran at the UN. The Russians and the Chinese would water them down as much as possible, but they were weak.
The heydays of unipolar world.
Yes, exactly. The hyperpower. So the United States was at the height of its power back then. It was not, it was a different world from today for your younger viewers. And it was not such a long time ago. I was your age, but it seems like it was 100 years ago. So the United States was immensely powerful. They invaded Iraq, they invaded Afghanistan. They surrounded Iran. They were in the Persian Gulf. These regimes in the Persian Gulf are basically, you know, in they'll do what the Americans want them to do. Every single one of them. Maybe like some of them would be a bit different, but not that much. They won't stand up to the United States in it by any means. So, and one senior American official said, "Real men go to Tehran," meaning that the objective is to take Tehran. So Iran began to prepare itself back then, and the United States didn't invade Iran. They never even bombed Iran. Why? Because even back then, when Iran was much weaker than it is today, because remember, Iran had just ended a war with Saddam Hussein in 1988, a war where the Americans and the Europeans helped impose. They gave Saddam chemical weapons to use against Iranians. The civilized world was giving him all these banned weapons to use against Iranians. I was gassed twice. When they talk about World War II and gas chambers, and then I was gassed by German chemical weapons. For me, people like me and people who survived in Iran, when the West talks about human rights, it's obvious. It's always been obvious that it's all nonsense. It's all show. They're the greatest violators of human rights on this planet. But part of the reason why, and this is something that I missed earlier, I'm sorry for my disorganized discussion. Part of the reason why people believe that the Israelis are strong is because we are Orientalized Orientals. We still believe what the West tells us. And this is something that I've seen in mainstream Indian media, that if the Reuters says it, if AP says it, if CNN says it, if the Washington Post says it, if the Guardian says it, then it must be true. And my experience has been that it's most probably not true. And if it is true, it is twisted. And history has, history, I think, shows it, but people have short memories or they don't go back for accountability. They don't look back. So Iran has been defeated here. So we have no more air defenses. We have no more missile capabilities. So we should, during the next exchange, Iran will not strike Israel hard anymore because Iran won't have the ability to fire off that many missiles anymore. But when that happens, no one is going to go back and say, so the Israelis were lying. Western media was lying. This was just propaganda. This was a part of the propaganda campaign. No, they'll go on to the next lie. And they'll believe that, and they will go on. That is because our minds have been colonized for hundreds of years. We've gained independence as countries. India is an independent country. Iran is an independent country. But many of us are, are intellectually, we are still colonized. So they continue to be an authority. Even when we oppose them, we will believe them or we give them more credit than that which they deserve. But time will tell. And the world is changing much more rapidly than people in the West think. Uh, Not just the BRICS summit. There's so many things happening in Ukraine, elsewhere, that I think it's going to dawn upon people that the West is sort of like the Wizard of Oz. It's not nearly as powerful as it thinks it is. And but I'm fine with the phrase "time will tell."
I liked your phrase, Oriental Orientalists. So it's not what Edward Said said, that how the colonialists represented us, but it's also us buying their narrative. So it's perhaps Said did not emphasize as much, but we understand that being from this part of the world.
Yes, or Malcolm X would call it the house Negro and the field Negro. The house Negro being the slave that is more compliant, who has interest in being with the master, and the slave Negro, or the field Negro is the person who's being brutalized the most and who hates the master. So we have or the comprador class. There are many terms for it. That the brown sahib, the person who mimics or tries to imitate. They love to read Western books and Western novels. They prioritize them over local culture, and the different parts. The different people have used different terms to orientalize. Oriental is basically those of us who we are the non-Westerners, but we are orientalized. We are Orientalists ourselves. We believe their worldview. We try to be like them. We try to be we try to look more civilized to them, but in their eyes. But as I said, the world is changing, and this is not going to continue for much longer, simply because the facts on the ground are 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 going to make the world a very different place in the near future. Things are changing much more rapidly than anyone ever imagined. The perpetual wars, the never-ending wars, the stupidity of liberal capitalism, and but also the war in Ukraine and the genocide in Gaza. The West in Gaza has exposed itself as being inhumane and barbaric. And the West is now being increasingly, they're a police state. Young people in Australia, young people in Canada and elsewhere, they're intimidated. Anyone who wants to protest against Israel is intimidated. They feel threatened that they'll lose their jobs, that they'll get into trouble. So it's evident, it's clear that the world is changing, and it's clear to people across the world what the West really is all about. The genocide is not something that will go away. It will be a very dark stain on the West for many decades to come, because this is the first genocide that has been carried out live in front of a global audience. And they will not stop it, despite the fact that we see it when we get up in the morning, and when we see it again when we want to go to bed at night. And it irritates us, even though big tech censors, it uses its algorithms downplay what goes on, even though many are banned. But still, it's so horrible and horrific and overwhelming that people still see it. And I think this has dealt a devastating blow so the Western economy has gone downhill. The Western military has gone downhill. Their military in Ukraine has failed. All their capabilities have failed to deter the Russians. In Gaza, the same is true, but more importantly, and in Lebanon, their military has failed, and in Iran. But more importantly, the image of the Israeli regime and the collective West that stands behind the Holocaust has been totally demolished, and that I think has all of these have quickened the pace of the demise of the Western Empire.
I remember your interview at The Wire, and I mean the recent interview. I think you did too, but the recent interview where the host was reading Western sources uncritically, and we noticed the irritation. We felt that because on one hand you wanted to be in solidarity, given this is not the Western press, but on the other hand you could also see through that these are Western narratives being read out uncritically and directly. I want to come to what you referred to as these regimes going with the Americans. I think you were referring to Saudi Arabia and UAE and other Gulf allies, probably not Qatar, I suppose, who has a much more complicated position within the geopolitics of the region. I was reading the news, and both UAE and Saudi Arabia condemned the Israeli attack, the Saturday attack on Iran. They have also been put in a hard place by the genocide in Gaza. And earlier we saw some sort of diplomatic opening between Saudi Arabia and Iran under the negotiating leadership of China. How do you look at the geopolitics of the region, and has it improved or is it going downhill?
It's very complicated. The U.S. is using its radar bases in Turkey, in Qatar, in Bahrain, and across the Persian Gulf against Iran. In the Israeli operation, these bases were used during Iranian retaliations. And remember, these are all the Israelis don't retaliate. It's the Iranians who retaliate. The Israelis and the Americans began aggression against Iran many decades ago. The first cyber attack against a country ever was carried out by the Americans and the Israelis against Iran. This was a couple of decades ago. Then they began to murder Iranian scientists. One of them was a colleague of mine at the University of Tehran. He was murdered in front of his wife. Then they murdered a number of Iranian officers that were fighting against ISIS and Al Qaeda. And this is something that Indians really don't know, by and large, that these groups, ISIS and Al Qaeda, these extremist Muslim groups that somehow many in India seem to associate with Muslims, these are groups that were created by the Israelis and the Americans and their allies. These are Western assets, and some of them have been transferred to Afghanistan now. And people in India don't recognize that, many people don't recognize that what they're attributing to Islam is actually, it should be attributed to the Israelis and the Americans who are creating this menace, who have created this menace. But in any case, the Iranians were fighting against ISIS and Al Qaeda and other extremist groups in Syria that were funded by NATO and their regional allies. And the Israelis would bomb Iranian officers and kill them. But the Iranian retaliation only began after the Israeli regime bombed the embassy in Damascus, and the West supported the Israelis at the UN Security Council. And then again, the Israelis murdered and martyred Ismail Haniyeh when he came to Tehran. He was the official guest of Iran. He came for the the then president-elect's inauguration ceremony, and he was murdered in an official guest house. So Iran retaliated again. So the Israeli strike on Iran was not a retaliation. It was another act of aggression. And the Iranians will be forced to retaliate. So I think that this is a key point, that the West supports aggression. The West is using its capabilities to help aggression, and countries in the region have been a part of this. The Incirlik Air Base in Turkey is being used against Iran and to help Israel. There's no doubt about that. The Turkish government is continuing to allow oil from the Republic of Azerbaijan, from Baku, to go to Israel, cheap oil. So their trade, although officially banned, they allow it to go through third parties like Greece to Israel and vice versa. Countries in the Persian Gulf, those that have established ties with the Israeli regime, continue to have ties with them, and others have trade. The trade goes through Jordan and through other countries into Jordan. So, but what Iran wants to do is to improve relations with neighboring countries and to draw them away as much as possible from the West, even if that's a small shift. A shift is still a shift. Iran wants peace in the Persian Gulf because peace in the Persian Gulf means better lives for Iranians. It means better lives for Saudis. It means better lives for the people of Kuwait and Iraq, and it means better lives for the people of India. But the Israelis and the Americans the Israelis are pushing things in the other direction. So the Israeli regime is putting the Indian economy at grave risk. But they don't care, as I said, because they only care about their own colony and crushing Palestinians. So what Iran wants, what these family dictatorships in the Persian Gulf want, is peace, because they know that in any confrontation with Iran, if they side with the Americans, or if the Americans strike Iran with all the bases and installations that they have, their regimes will be gone, all of them. They're all very weak and vulnerable regimes. So they're in a tough place, but they don't have the sort of independence that India has. Saudi Arabia is not India. The Emirates is not India. These are they are very dependent on the West. So if the West pushes, what can they do? They'll just pack their bags and move to their palaces in North America. Although if the global economy collapses, even the rich will be affected tremendously. No one is going to go unscathed. It will be something that is really beyond our imagination. The implications in each country, in each part of the world, how many tens, if not hundreds of millions of people will be on the move. God knows. God forbid we see such a day. But the governments in these Arab family regimes in the Persian Gulf region, they, if the Israelis force the Americans to do something, they will be gone, and their leaders will have left their private jet, these countries in their private jets before the first missile strikes.
That reminds me of how I mean, as people from the post-colonial world, we read history of decolonization and how settlers would scramble to move back once colonization collapses. You